Now, in this video, I want to just wrap up chapter 2 of Griffin's work on human rights, first steps in an account of HR, sections 2.8, 2.9. 2.8 says, asks the question, in what sense are human rights universal? They're not, he says, completely universal, right? So they're what? Partially universal? Isn't that kind of a contradiction? Well, admittedly, it is a strange way of talking. So he tries to give some kind of motivation for seeing them as pretty well universal, but not necessarily. There's a bit of hedging going on in here. So it's not entirely clear, but let's see what we can make of it. So Griffin's agent, we've talked about, is a normative agency, a notion of an agent as a self-determiner, right? You know, the agent, what we're protecting is that great capacity of the human agent to make evaluations, conceptualizations of the worthwhile life. Again, not like a Socratic thing, not like a planned out thing, but a good life. And some people are just naturally pretty good at that. So they don't have to be philosophers and state planners and things like that. They can have it just sort of a natural kind of an agent as a self-determiner. But it's a dynamic capacity and it's vulnerable. So it's a valuable thing, but it's somewhat robust. But Griffin stresses over and over, that's really why we have human rights, is to protect this kind of agency that we value so highly, right? And we do, right? You know, most people really don't like being told what to think and what to do, right? So in that sense, it is, you know, you can call it vulnerable or delicate or whatever, but very valuable, right? Kind of like a little flower, right? We value it. It's wonderful, and it's something that we want to preserve, but it's not the most robust thing in the world. But it's definitely something that we want to preserve. So human rights now are going to be, you know, they're grounded in this notion of agency, but they're not completely universal. So what exactly is he talking about when he says not completely universal? Well, you know, he says that in some senses, you know, that you might say that you know, your agency is not necessarily always under threat, although later on in the chapter he says he thinks it is. But, you know, in certain kinds of societies that your evaluative and all these kinds of things are more valuable and more vulnerable. Let's say in a high-paced, you know, sort of modern society that unfortunately not everybody lives in, but you know that a lot of us do live in, where you know, your agency is extremely important because you have to use it to make all kinds of decisions. It's an information-based society, etc., etc. But there would be other societies where, and Griffin says, you know, more kind of hunter-gatherer societies that where that's not the kind of life that they're in. They're not in those structured kinds of things. So then perhaps the agency that he's so worried about protecting really isn't under a threat there. However, at the end of it all, he thinks that he says that human rights may not enjoy complete universality, but you know, they're sort of universal enough. And in this case, he says we shouldn't get too uptight about that if we say there are situations where human rights may not completely apply, because he says, look, you know, there's places even where morality doesn't apply, that it's not completely universal. What would that be? Well, here's one example that you can think of. It's not necessarily Griffin's example, but you know, like in a situation, let's say if you're making decisions about war, and let's say you're going to be losing to some kind of you know, horrific bunch like Nazi Germany, something like that, and you're in command, and you realize, just for the sake of discussion, that by following that if you don't do something different, you're going to lose the war. The way you've been fighting, according to the laws of war, and you're fighting the quote-unquote good fight, you're going to lose. And it's going to be a disaster if you lose. Like it's going to be enslavement, etc., etc., all the horrors of living under a Nazi occupying regime would be. So the question is, you do anything to save yourself, right? And Griffin does give the line of, you know, to each, you know, every person for himself or herself, under certain circumstances, the morality just evaporates. And some just war theorists, you know, call them extreme measures, where the rules just don't apply anymore. Like that's it, right? If you're in a situation where you're facing, imminent annihilation, it might not be the case that you can do just absolutely anything, but definitely many things that you would normally be prohibited from doing might just not be prohibited anymore. It just like that morality might almost be evaporating. Like as things get more and more intense and more closer and closer to annihilation, you'd say that morality is just evaporating, right? So that leads you to think, okay, these are not absolutely radically universal. You may not like that notion of, partially universal or radically universal or whatever, starting to qualify the notion of universality. But Griffin is saying that's not something unusual. We do talk like that. So even if your human rights are not completely universal, that's not exactly a weird or unusual way of talking. We do talk about it, as he said, in morality as well. We'd say, wow, if that's the situation, then kind of morality and fair play goes out the window. Even, like that old expression, all's fair in love and war. You may not agree with that, but you might say, well, under certain circumstances, morality pretty well almost completely breaks down and doesn't make any sense anymore. Well, if you're willing to say that, then you're not saying something too far from what Griffin's saying. Is there some cases or situations where the notion of human rights may not really apply? So it's in what sense are they're pretty universal, pretty well in the sense of any kinds of society or whatever. We are talking about human rights as being applicable. But just I would just add the other note that we do this even in science. Like some of our best theories, they don't work perfectly, right? We do know, for instance, take the two great theories in physics of the 20th century, quantum mechanics and general relativity. Well, they give different answers in certain places. Something's got to be wrong there. Something's not working. So we can say in certain contexts, these theories are, in a sense, in some ways, they are incomplete. They don't give us all the answers to everything. They do conflict. So even science has to deal with the fact that it's, mostly universal, but we don't pitch out science, right? So we shouldn't pitch out morality or get too uptight if we run into some things that we'd say, well, morality, human rights, I don't know what to say. It might not apply here. So that's going back to Griffin's original problem is human rights may not be there. It's indeterminate as a concept. We've been trying to fill this in, and we may not have a perfect place. We may not arrive at a perfect notion where it's just absolutely universal, or we may even get it where we can say quite clearly where it doesn't apply and where it does. So the fact that it might not be completely universal is not that huge of a deal, but it's just something that we have to maybe get a little bit used to talking like it in this context, but we do it in other contexts. So again, now Griffin, though, does at the end of this section kind of pose something odd that on the one hand it is completely universal because the human rights are connected to their personhood, and we have that in virtue of being human agents, right? That's what we are. So wouldn't it seem that is radically universal? So he's not entirely clear at the end. There's a little bit of fudging going on at the end of this. So it would seem that, more to work out in the context of the rest of the book. So stay tuned for that. Okay, so to finish up this preliminary discussion, do we need in the end a more pluralistic account? And Griffin goes and examines this in two senses, from practical arguments that say, yes, okay, so if let's say for the sake of discussion, we follow along with Griffin and he says, do we need this? And he says, yeah, well, practical argument in favor, he looks at the issue of torture, I'll talk about that in a second, and theoretical arguments in favor. Now, he doesn't think we do, but so he looks at this notion of torture and says, okay, do we need, a specific human right against torture? And then he asks, as we say, well, what's the problem with torture? And he looks at it from the issue of, you might say, well, we need a human right against torture because torture inflicts great pain. And then he examines that and he says, well, not the case that torture is the only thing that inflicts great pain. There's lots of things that inflict great pain, but we wouldn't say there's a human rights violation. So torture is not prohibited simply because, not denying that it inflicts great pain, but that's not the reason why it's a violation of a human right. Why is it a violation of a human right? Well, he says because it's a certain kind of subversion of the autonomy of the individual, right? It's the ultimate act of trying to make some kind of subject into an object, if I can put it in kind of quasi-Kantian terms, is that you're subverting someone's will and bending it completely through pain. But there are ways of torture that are not painful, that we would say, certain kinds of drugs or whatever, they would extract, and we would call those means of torture as well. Maybe you want to debate that, but Griffin says there would be quote unquote non-painful but highly subversive ways of extracting information that we would say, yeah, that's kind of torture, even though it's not as painful. Why is it? But it subverts the individual, and that goes back to his notion of the agent. It's subverting the agency. So the agent, the evaluative, the notion of the freedom, the liberty of the agent is being completely violated, and that and so blocking that, blocking the ability or the legitimacy or any attempt to violate the agent's autonomy is already covered through personhood. So you don't need a particular human right against torture. By virtue of basing human rights on personhood, you've already got an argument against torture because it flows out of the safeguarding of the normative agency, right? This ability to make decisions and whatnot. That is, shall we say, jeopardized or threatened or dissolved or crushed under torture. So you don't need a specific thing for torture. It's not that torture is okay. It's not okay, but you just don't need a particular human right against it because you've got it through personhood. So that's a practical argument in favor that Griffin thinks that fails. I can get the prohibition on torture through personhood. I don't need a specific human right against torture. It's a violation of your rights by a violation of your personhood. He then goes off into a fairly lengthy discussion of theoretical arguments in favor of pluralistic accounts. You can have a look at those. In the end, he gives some kind of hand-waving discussions, all interesting, as Griffin's arguments tend to be, and his discussions are. But he thinks in the end that they all fail. That in sum, that all we need to ground human rights is the personhood and the practicalities issue, and he's going to pull it off doing that. So that brings this chapter to a close. But he admits that he's just really started. This is sort of a preliminary discussion of all these concepts. He will be returning them. As you've noticed in many of these videos, I've said, well, this is not extremely detailed yet, or it's not satisfactory or whatnot. Well, let's follow Griffin and the rest of the book as we jump in the next video into chapter 3, where he's going to go and revisit some of these things in a deeper sense, more practical senses, more theoretical, in attempts to flesh all this out. But chapter 2 is basically just, remember, first steps in an account of human rights. See you next video.